All right, it has gone 11, and there's more and more people joining. But just to try and get things started, I might start the introductory stuff. Welcome to today's webinar. What is surely going to be a fascinating couple of talks looking at basin scale river management and having a look at cross-border challenges that we see with basin scale management. And I've just on this introductory slide, I've got obviously a couple of pretty good examples of basin scale cross-border challenges that we see around the world, starting with Cooper Creek in Queensland, the Mekong River, where you see quite significant challenges between Laos and Thailand, given the river is often used as the border between the two countries. Some pretty interesting challenges with the Ganges River catchment, with multiple countries involved with that catchment and the broader Brahmaputra as well. And then obviously Colorado River in the US. Today, the webinar is being hosted by me. I'm the Queensland chapter lead for the RBMS, and Genevieve Smith, who's our tech lead, with support from the broader RBMS community as well. I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples and original custodians of Australia's lands and waters, and honour their elders past, present and emerging. Specifically, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, who are the original custodians of the Brisbane region where I reside. We acknowledge and respect the continuing deep spiritual connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to country and their unique ability to care for country. Just a bit of an intro to the Q&A Zoom features. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please just use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and not the chat or the raise hand function. You can upvote questions by selecting the thumbs up to a question that appears in the Q&A window. And questions will be responded to in the 5-minute Q&A section at the end of each presentation. And any questions that remain will be responded to after both of the presentations are finished, or recorded and responded to offline and sent to all registered attendees. Just a bit of a background to transboundary rivers. There are 263 transboundary rivers basins worldwide. There's 145 states that have territory within one of these basins, and there's 30 countries in the world that lie entirely within them. Since 1948, there have been 37 incidents of acute conflict over water, and during the same period, about 295 water agreements have been signed. However, 2/3 of the world's transboundary rivers do not have a cooperative management framework. And I think that probably leads quite well into our presentations. The first of which is by Kim Whiteoak from Canopy Economics and Policy, looking at river management in the European Union through the Water Framework Directive, Lessons for Australia. And that'll be followed by David Winfield and Simon Tilleard of Alluvium, talking about the BasinGuide, a guide to river basin planning, bringing Australia's experience to assess cross-border water management in the Indo-Pacific. Now, Simon and David are presenting today, but that's co-authored by Tony Webber, David Harris, and Dr. Melita Grant. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Kim. He can start the proceedings, and we'll go from there. I'll stop sharing my screen, Kim, so you can share yours. That's great. Thanks, Kim.
Beautiful. How's that? Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect. Lovely.
Righto. Well, thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and thanks everyone for joining. As Ben mentioned, my name's Kim Whiteoak. I'm an environmental and resource economist from here in Melbourne. I have a focus professionally on water issues and biodiversity issues, and sometimes together, but sometimes separate. I'm here based in Melbourne. I grew up in Brisbane, trained in Canberra, and have lived in Melbourne for the 15 years essentially prior to going overseas to Europe a couple of years ago. So I moved with my family to Europe in the second half of 2018 for 2 years. And I worked with a company there who do a lot of work for the European Commission. So this is the supranational body that administers the European Union. And they have a sort of a legislative review process where their legislation gets reviewed and improved. I'll talk a little bit about that process later, because I think it's quite interesting and useful for us. But as part of the work that I did there, I worked on what they call a fitness check, which is an evaluation of more than one piece of legislation that relates. So the Water Framework Directive is the primary legislative piece on water management, rivers and rivers, lakes and groundwater. And also the Floods Directive. So they obviously interact and overlap. But we worked on a fitness check of those, which is like a backward-looking evaluation of how that's performed since 2000. But I also worked on the evaluation of the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2020, which is not so much a legislative piece, it's a strategic document that they do every 10 years. And we are just concluding the evaluation of that, which has a relationship to water, which I'll come on to. And lastly, also working on the impact assessment, which is forward-looking about the next EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030, which also has ambitions and targets for relating to freshwater management. So I'll sort of touch on that. But today, I'm just going to talk about the Water Framework Directive and river basin management in the EU. I had no exposure to it previously, and I thought it's quite interesting learning about it, evaluating that framework, and then thinking about it in the context of what we do here. But just for context, this is a chart of a map of the river basins in Europe. There are 177 river basin districts, which hold more than one river basin usually. There are 94 international river basins, which are river basins that cross national boundaries within the EU, and this covers over 111,000 surface water bodies and over 13,000 groundwater bodies. So I'll just talk a bit about this framework, the Water Framework Directive. So it was set up in 2000, and essentially what it did was basically started with a definition of river basins and districts defined in their sort of catchments, basically geological catchments. The main instrument, or the main sort of power behind the Water Framework Directive is this legal target. So it's a legally binding target with legal consequences if you don't achieve the outcome, that all the member states of the European Union, or 27 now, which is 26 with Great Britain leaving, but they all committed to. So basically the sort of headline target is that all water bodies, groundwater and surface water, will reach what they call good status. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the original intention was that would be achieved by 2015. That did not happen, so they shift to the next cycle of 2021, which also did not happen. And so now the final date of the Water Framework Directive is 2027. I think it will continue thereafter, but in the legislation, I think there's only, it's supposed to sort of conclude, I guess, or they don't talk about what's to happen after that. That'll be decided in the next sort of 5 or 6 years. So the good status I'll come on to in a bit more detail, but essentially it's ecological condition and chemical condition, and for groundwater, so that's surface water, so ecological condition and chemical condition, these sort of targets for those, and groundwater also has volumetric targets as well, so water balance. But they also had an aspect that there are some other elements, like they do require full cost recovery pricing for water, including environmental, which draws on the polluter pays principle, which the European Union is very strong on, and they're trying to push that a lot more in future. They talk about moving our taxation from incomes to polluters, which is a very sort of bold ambition. We'll see how far they go with that. But I think that's an interesting framework. I mean, it's not necessarily implemented all that well yet, but certainly the target is there and they're building toward it. So this chart just shows a little bit more about the assessment of status. So as you can see, it's divided into surface water and groundwater. There's that they're looked at separately. So surface water, as I mentioned, has measures for ecological status or potential, where as well as chemical status. Chemical status is somewhat easier to measure, I think, than ecological status. So they do tend to lean on these priority substances, this list of substances that will be measured and monitored. Groundwater looks at the chemical status, so nitrate, pesticides, and other groundwater pollutants, and they look at quantitative status, so that water balance. Now, you might, from an Australian perspective, look at this and say, well, why isn't quantitative status included in surface waters? And certainly, I was asking that question early on. And as I understand it, they have this term they use called subsidiarity, which is to say, if the issue is best dealt with at a national or member state level, they invoke subsidiarity and they don't include it at the EU level. And I think that's sort of a political reality and a political check where they can say, look, if this issue isn't going to progress at the EU level, we can invoke subsidiarity. And I think they've done that for surface water quantity. So I think, they weren't happy with the supranational body deciding, on water extractions effectively, I believe. So then basically you assess, on the colourful bars, you can see the status of each of those, and they combine to overall status. So you either achieve good status or you don't. They have this rule called the one out, all out rule, which is to say, if you fail on any of these, you fail overall. So you have to achieve good status across the board. And if you don't achieve good status. And it's somewhat controversial because some have said, you have these ubiquitous substances like mercury that are sort of endemic. They're now part of that environment that might have been historic, say in a riverbed or the sediment of a lake that's no more accumulating, but it's obviously not also degrading. So you might fail on good status, but the only way to remove it would be to drain the entire lake and remove all the sediment, which is not really feasible. So that's one of the controversies. But I really wanted to talk about the process of river basin management plans in the Water Framework Directive, which I really found very interesting. They start by defining the basins and defining the governance structure, which is essentially allocating what they call a competent authority. So some entity at the member state level that is responsible for the delivery of the River Basin Management Plan and the implementation of that process. After which they then go and collect data to characterise the basin, and importantly, they collect data on identifying pressures and impacts that are affecting water bodies in the basin. After which they develop a program of measures, they call it, which is a series of actions that will be implemented, and if implemented would achieve good status. So they've worked out essentially what status they're in now and what they would need to do to achieve good status. And they have this sort of cost effectiveness test. So while they require you to meet good status, they also say, you only have to implement measures that are cost effective. So the example I gave before about, draining a lake and removing all the sediment might not pass that cost effectiveness test. So you then implement cost effective measures, review their effectiveness of the program of measures, and then thereafter sort of monitor and report. And you repeat that cycle every 6 years. So you report in your river basin management plans, that goes to the European Commission, which then review, and they are the body that could hold legal sanctions. So one of the interesting things is, while I think this is a really logical and stepwise process, they do have some get out of jail cards. So they have exemptions that you can apply unilaterally without European Commission, approval. You as a member state can decide that you're going to put exemptions on some river bodies. So they could be, for seeking time extensions or reasons of technical feasibility, natural conditions, or disproportionate cost. So in fact, 50% of water bodies in the EU are under an exemption at the moment. So you can see that they've been rather highly used. But by 2027, most of those exemptions will not be allowed to be used. So at the final cycle, one will, and I think it's natural conditions. I'm not sure actually, but so those exemptions will run out. But clearly, that's a bit of a challenge for them. And given the topic of today of transboundary cooperation, I thought I'd mention a little bit about that. So this is a map that highlights the transboundary river basins in the EU. So the category 1 river basins in blue that you can see there, this means they have like the full structure in place. They have river basin management plans, they have a cooperation body, and they have cooperation agreements between the neighbouring member states. So they're in place for probably like the highest profile river basins in Europe. So the Danube, the Elbe and the Rhine and those kind of river basins. Then in category 2, in yellow, this means they've got a cooperation body. So they have a competent authority, but they have no management plan in place. And then category 3 in green means they have a cooperation agreement between the member states, but they don't have a cooperation body or a management plan. So there aren't that many category 1s. So getting to this issue of transboundary cooperation, the Water Framework Directive develops this process for managing transboundary cooperation, but the same types of challenges remain that we face here about managing these divergent issues. So it's not a magic pill, but it does develop this process, but it doesn't mean that the process is perfectly implemented, and they have similar challenges that I think we face here in Australia. But one issue, water sharing is sort of less of a predominant concern there as it is here. Water scarcity is somewhat less of an issue, and it's more heavily focused on Southern Europe, where they really have greater water scarcity. And so it just doesn't dominate their thinking that the way I think it does in Australia, which is one difference we might talk about later. So how has it worked? This is a chart. These are 2 charts of surface water bodies and the ecological status and chemical status. So, at a headline figure of achieving good status by 2015, 2021, that was not achieved. So for surface water bodies, around 40% of surface waters achieved good status, have achieved good ecological and chemical status, and around 80% for groundwater. So, their headline figure, has not been achieved, but they also have an ambition of non-deterioration. And non-deterioration has been largely successful. So, which is to say, overall, water bodies in the EU are no longer in decline. And I'm not sure we could say the same for our water bodies in Australia. So I actually think that's a really significant achievement of essentially, put a floor under things, and things are improving, but somewhat slowly. But this issue I raised before, about 50% of water bodies under an exemption, and there will be an issue about how that is dealt with post 2027 when they'll have to put in new arrangements. It's really highly supported by people. When we did the fitness check, you do an open public consultation, and huge interest from respondents and huge support across the board. It is considered to be one of the most ambitious sort of structures for water management in the world at a scale of this kind. And it's really highly supported, and there's sort of no suggestion that their ambition would be reduced. It's in fact going to increase, as I'll talk about in a little bit. So I think there's been a lot of progress despite the headline figure not being achieved. Certainly data is much improved after the first round of river basin management plans. A lot of them, they really still didn't know the status of the water bodies. And now that uncertainty is reduced a lot. So now in the second lot of river basin management plans, in the second cycle, that the list of unknowns has declined significantly. But I also think that the relatively easy wins have been made, and in future, improvement is going to have to come in conflict, I believe, with agriculture, where, you know, I think a lot of the improvement was made previously through the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which was essentially reducing wastewater, untreated wastewater, and pollutants from centralised wastewater treatment plants. Whereas in future, this diffuse pollution from agriculture is going to have to be challenged, and I think we have some familiar themes here. Oh, sorry. So, yeah, I also wanted to talk about this process for legislative review. So I was unfamiliar with this before moving to Europe, but I really, you know, after being exposed to it for a couple of years, it just seems like such a logical, almost obvious process, you know. So when legislation is developed in the EU, they undertake an impact assessment. You know, we undertake a RIS process as well, I think, at national and state level. So they develop an impact assessment for legislation, and then the member states vote on whether they'll proceed with it. And it's not perhaps as heavily focused on a cost-benefit analysis as it is here, which I think allows, you know, environmental legislation that for which costs and benefits are more difficult to assemble, it allows that to proceed perhaps more readily than it might here. And once in place, they have this process of continuous improvement. So there's a midterm evaluation and then final evaluation. For the Water Framework Directive, there was a midterm evaluation earlier, I think in 2012 or 2015. And then, you know, we did this fitness check that finished the end of 2019, 2020. We're now working on an impact assessment for the next iteration, which is focusing on these list of substances and the process for monitoring and reporting. So the impact assessment is forward-looking. So once you've got the results of an evaluation that says what worked and didn't work, so backward-looking, they'll then propose an improvement in the next round. So the legislation will be further developed and improved. So you've got this continuous improvement process. You also have independent and transparent assessments. So you get external input. The terms of reference is developed. I guess that the European Commission staff will develop that, but there's boundaries around what they can and can't do. But it certainly isn't just at the discretion of a minister like it might be here. So there's quite a lot of independent and transparent involvement and a lot of consultation. So they have formalized consultation processes with you know, open public consultations. They have workshops. They have engaged with business groups, NGOs, and it's quite formal. And you know, the process of that consultation really takes quite has a strong impact. And I can say as a consultant working on them that you really do incorporate those perspectives and you have to report on them. Of course, there's legal consequence if you don't deliver in relation to directives. The Water Framework Directive is a legal instrument, and regulation is an even stricter legislative tool. And it just occurred to me, you know, I just don't think we have anything like this process in Australia. With our legislation, there is no sort of formalised process of review and improvement. It's somewhat at the discretion of ministers whether a piece of legislation will be reviewed at all. They can also set the terms of reference, and they can essentially ignore whatever results that they choose to. So, you know, it made me really reflect on our process for legislative development and implementation. So yeah, that's a interesting aspect of the European Union process, I think. In relation to where next, so like I mentioned, the Water Framework Directive sort of, I mean, I say it ends in 2027, it will continue, but the process of the third cycle ends in 2027, and they're yet to decide sort of what will take place thereafter. I mentioned we're currently working on an impact assessment focused on this sort of listing of chemicals in the priority substances and sort of processes for monitoring and reporting and ways to improve that. So there's already steps in place to improve the Water Framework Directive in future. And I'm also involved in an impact assessment on ecosystem restoration targets. So this is in the biodiversity strategy to 2030. So they're proposing restoration of at least 10 ecosystem areas, of which freshwater is one, wetlands are another. And they're proposing sort of a legal instrument, so like a directive or a regulation that will define the amount and type and process for ecosystem restoration targets in the EU. So for freshwater in rivers, they're focused on river continuity. So they're focusing on this target in the biodiversity strategy to 2030, which is 25,000 kilometres of free flowing rivers, which from memory is, sounds like a lot. It's 2 or 3%, I think, of the total river length. So an additional 25,000 kilometres. But I guess my point there is that their ambition is growing and it's not shrinking. So I kind of feel here that sometimes, well, it feels like our environmental ambition in terms of policy, certainly at a national level, seems to be shrinking rather than growing. But it made me realise when I'm over there that they're not shrinking from this ambition. They're actually leaning into it. And COVID has really actually pushed them with a European Green Deal to push forward with their environmental ambition. It ties a lot, I think, into climate as well. I mean, the climate ambition of the European Union compared to here in Australia is, chalk and cheese. They are really not mucking around, and they're going to be throwing so much resources at climate. And I think they've recognised the relationship between climate and biodiversity, that they have to be sort of dealt with together and they can be managed together. And obviously, a lot of the ecosystems that we're looking at can be and are carbon sinks. So they do have a natural relationship anyway. So some conclusions. I just thought there were some key features here that are useful for us to reflect on. And firstly, this clear time-bound and legally binding targets. They're not afraid to do that in Europe. They're really happy to set ambitious, legally binding targets that really drive investment. The Water Framework Directive hasn't been perfect, but it's mobilised a lot of resources that otherwise wouldn't. And I think that's the power of regulation. You really can do that. Once you have legislative targets, you can motivate a lot of resources to be spent on outcomes that you want to achieve. There's also this logical process of river basin planning and management that I think is really quite elegant, and we could learn from. I think we have parallels with certainly with the presentation that David and Simon will give next, with some ideas from Australia, obviously, and used elsewhere. This transparent process of continuous improvement, it seems so obvious to me now that should be part of our legislative structures for river basin management, and that we could draw from. And lastly, like I mentioned, this high and growing ambition, it's real, and it will have real outcomes. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of pushing for a bit more than perhaps we have done in the past. So that's everything from me. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for your attention, and I'll throw back to Ben.
Thanks, Kim. Sorry, I was just sorting out technology here. So if anybody has any questions for Kim, if you could leave them in the question and answer panel, which can be accessed from the bottom of your screen. There was one comment in the chat. I'll just bring that up. From Michelle O'Donnell, saying, "Hi all, I am from Ireland, so have done some work with the WFD. I think it is important to note that the categorisation of the water bodies as needing to all recognise the status of good speaks to the cultural connection of various cultures to land and water, and seeing them as one and being connected similar to traditional owners in Australia. It also supports the different cultural values and uses of the water bodies by seeking to manage with a holistic view. It also supports reporting on the socio-economic benefits of water to the variety of cultures." I'm not sure if you've got anything to add to that, Kim.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the holistic nature of that process, you know, my view is that was always the intent of the Water Framework Directive. And that process is a really, I think it's a very elegant, holistic process of trying to consider all of these different aspects in developing a program of measures and delivering the outcomes that they want to achieve. I think, you know, from what I could tell, I perhaps have, you know, shorter background than Michelle might with the implementation of it. But, you know, it seemed to get reduced to this compliance process of good status. When we were doing the evaluation, that was really the focus when we were speaking to the member state competent authorities. Like, they're so heavily focused on compliance, and I think the European Commission is too. And in some ways, it becomes a natural kind of lean because you've got this quantitative good status measurement. So you tend to focus on that as an outcome, but it was never meant to be the focus. I think that the good status targets were supposed to sort of support the River Basin Management Planning and that holistic approach. I see Michelle's responded.
Yeah, did you want to read that?
Yeah, so she'll ask, what do you think has been its biggest failing in implementation? They have a lot of assessments, but have been struggling with evaluating and reporting. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's been in place for 20 years, so it's hard to argue that it's still new and that they're still working on it. I mean, it has improved. Its biggest failing, I mean, there's been a few. I seem to, you know, I personally think that the overuse of exemptions is probably the main one that I picked up. You know, 50% of water bodies under an exemption, and you know, I guess they have to walk a line. It's a very difficult process to develop, but you know, the process of exemptions that you can a member state can apply an exemption just for itself without explanation. I mean, they kind of are supposed to explain why they're doing it, but they don't really. So that's probably been, you know, probably a get out of jail card that has been used a bit too much. The approach, I mean, I'm an economist. The approach to pricing, you know, full cost recovery, I think is a really important part of it, including environmental outcomes. But that really, it's not clear that full cost recovery is done in many places very well. And so that's been a big failure as well. I think that's really challenging for us here as well, to try to incorporate this sort of polluter pays principle and ensure that the full environmental costs of water use are included in the price. I don't think we do that, although we attempt it with our water markets. It's possible to do that if you're not over allocating, but we've got challenges there as well. That would be my perspective on its sort of main failures.
Thanks, Kim. Another question from Jessica Walker. Hi, Kim. Thanks for the great presentation. What are your thoughts on the strength of the EU framework for addressing water scarcity and water scarcity's impacts on river health and biodiversity indicators, and then facilitating water sharing arrangements?
Yeah, so water scarcity, like I mentioned, it's implicit in the Water Framework Directive. So, I mean, the Water Framework Directive is explicitly, you know, the targets are on water quality, and obviously water scarcity has a relationship with water quality, but it you know, you could cut to the chase and focus on water scarcity, which I think is what we do here in Australia, because extraction is such a key feature, and water scarcity is such a predominant issue here. So, when I arrived there at the end of 2018, I started working on this, and I just couldn't understand why there was no mention of scarcity. Why does it not have a feature? And I think in the end, it's this issue of subsidiarity that it was possibly, I don't know this is my impression, but my impression is that it was so politically sensitive and driven by agricultural extraction. Again, my guess, I don't know this, but that was deemed to be too sensitive an issue to leave to a supranational body, that meant that countries did not want an external body deciding on how much they would use water and for what purposes, for example. So they've got a lot of work to do. I don't think they're dealing with that issue all that well. Although, to be fair, in the reporting on the river basin management plans, I was surprised to see how few river basins report scarcity as a key issue. It possibly is just less of a predominant issue there than it is here. I think certainly in Southern Europe it's a big deal, but in other parts of Europe, Northern Europe, it really doesn't feature that much. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Kim. We do have another question, but I think just in the interest of moving on to David and Simon's talk, we might leave that one until after their talk, so we can have a kind of all-encompassing conversation. So I'm going to hand over to David and Simon, who will be talking about a guide to river basin planning, bringing Australia's experience to assist cross-border water management in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop sharing my screen, David and Simon, and you share yours.
Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. Thanks, Kim, for the first presentation. We had a bit of a chat between Kim and Dave and myself last week, and it was really interesting to see the similarities in what we'll be presenting and what the Water Framework Directive framework and structure is. Just to start with, in addition to Ben's acknowledgement of country, as we're sitting in Canberra, acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the traditional owners and custodians of this land that we're sitting on, and pay respect to their elders, past and present. This painting is very special for Alluvium staff. It was developed by an artist called Vicky Golding and commissioned by the Alluvium Group, and it tells the story of water across country, from catchment to coast, with people from all cultures learning, understanding, sharing stories, walking to and meeting at the places, meeting places as one nation. And it's a good introduction to this presentation, as it really emphasises sharing and talking, and the BasinGuide, which we'll be talking about today, places a strong focus on the integration of a wide range of perspectives, including those of Indigenous peoples, as a core component to successful and sustainable water resources management, particularly in a transboundary context. But before we go too far into the BasinGuide, a bit of context to start with. So globally, there's about 2 billion people experiencing high water stress, and this is going to increase to about 1.3 billion by 2030. Of these, there's about 1.6 billion currently living in transboundary river basins, which are the focus of today's discussion. This is a particularly acute issue in the Indo-Pacific, where livelihoods are so dependent on water resources. The environment is getting stressed, and there's rapidly changing climate overlaying this. It's also a region where there's huge major transboundary rivers. Ben mentioned the Gunga and the Mekong, and there's several other large transboundary rivers within the region. Without a good, effective governance or planning framework, the water scarcity can often lead to disputes at local, national and international levels. And this is obviously an even more challenging situation in river basins. As members of the River Basin Management Society, I don't think we need to sell you on the importance of basin management and basin planning, and the critical role that it can play in addressing these challenges, these global challenges that are being felt within our region and within our country as well. So that was the purpose of BasinGuide. It's draws on the Australian experience to try and present a generalised framework for how basin planning can be undertaken. It's meant to be a reference for practitioners undertaking river basin planning in the Indo-Pacific region in particular, but we think also useful more broadly globally. It does have a bit of a focus on water planning, surface water planning, although it does strongly recognise the importance of considering and integrating groundwater and surface water interactions into your planning process, and has a focus on quantity, so sharing on water resources rather than quality, although again, it recognises the importance and provides some frameworks for also integrating the quality perspective. It's an interesting, perhaps slight difference between the Australian and European focus as well. The audience is intended to be both government agencies, staff, but as well, and on all ranges of government agency staff, but also NGOs, communities, stakeholder groups, giving them a bit of a framework to have discussions with the government agencies and to help drive basin planning in a good direction. Just to first recognise the funding, guidance and publishing by the Australian Water Partnership, which is an initiative of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Without them, we wouldn't have this guide, so thanks to them. And to also recognise the core development team. As I'll note soon, that we purposely took a very collaborative approach, drawing in a wide range of perspectives to prepare the guide. But this was sort of the core team that helped pull things together. So David Harris brought a strong basin and water planning, river operations and interstate negotiation perspective. He used to be the New South Wales Commissioner for Water. David Winfield brought a strong policy and regulation and pollution control perspective. He's previously from MDBA, but currently now at Alluvium. Melita brought a strong institutional development, stakeholder engagement, and a gender and disability focus into the work, and she's from UTS, Institute for Sustainable Futures. Tony Webber brought in modelling and data perspective and their importance for integrating and informing basin planning. And I helped bring in a bit of an international perspective about how we can best frame the guide to be most useful for countries in our region. So as I mentioned, we purposely took a very collaborative approach to this. We wanted it to be a product supported by people across Australia and that spoke to people across Australia's experiences, as well as bring in some perspectives from international people as well. So it was informed by some previous work that we undertook in India. So very much informed discussions and progress with Indian water planners about basin planning in their country. Very much informed the development of this piece of work. And then we held both an expert workshop, which this photo is here, which brought in both people from across every state and territory in Australia, as well as from communities and government agencies, and also some key Australian experts that have done quite a lot of work across the Indo-Pacific region in particular, whether it be South Asia, Southeast Asia or the Pacific. We also ran a process of expert reviews once we had a fairly final document. It was reviewed by people like the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, Commonwealth Environmental Waterholder, different state agencies, representatives of Indigenous First Nations peoples, and communities and environmental advocates. So really tried to run a strong collaborative process to make sure this was both captured all the different perspectives, but also was a document that people could really pick up and move forward with because they believed in what it was talking about. So the outcome of the process was identification of 7 key stages of basin planning, each with a set of guiding questions. And so again, whilst this drew on the Australian experience, it didn't necessarily try and document exactly how it was done in the Murray-Darling and other areas, as we believe that work's been done quite extensively elsewhere. But it tried to take that experience and condense it down to a key framework and key steps. won't go into detail in this diagram or this slide on the exact steps, as we'll be going through each of them individually, but important to emphasize here that they're not necessarily consecutive steps. All 7 of them are likely to overlap or need to overlap to some degree in implementing basin planning and basin management. And basin planning is an ongoing cycle of adaptive management. We need to engage with the risk and decision making with what information we have at the time. But then we also need to be building new knowledge and reviewing and adapting to that new knowledge over time as well. And so it's very much not meant to be consecutive stages. It's meant to be an iterative and a repeating process. To jump quickly, or to move into the steps, the stages of the guide, and I'll do the first stage, initiation, then I'll pass to Dave for the following stages. So initiation is really all about getting the process started. Whilst it's quite often, whilst basin planning is quite often done to respond to a challenge, whether it's water scarcity or pollution or river deterioration, it can also be done proactively, although there's probably limited examples of the case. So for example, it was largely driven, I guess, in the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia through the deterioration of the rivers, as well as increasing competition for the water resources of the river. Regardless of what the drivers are, it's important to first get an understanding of why you are undertaking basin planning and what the drivers, and particularly the difference in drivers between the jurisdictions are. So whether it's different states in the Australian case or different countries in the European and other cases. Important to understand why everyone is interested in undertaking basin planning. Some other critical considerations for the initiation stage that we identify in the BasinGuide are the critical need to build a network of support within interested stakeholders, and support both for the need of basin planning and the process that's going to happen as well, and support both from communities as well as political leadership to make sure that the basin planning process can continue. To work with different stakeholders to identify the different values and objectives that they each would like to get out of the basin planning process, and to identify both a vision, to identify a vision and then a set of objectives. So the vision to provide a guiding principle and a high-level direction to the planning process, but then a set of objectives as well to actually provide some more practical interpretation of that vision to then inform your planning process. I mean, as an example, in a basin in India that we're looking at, there'd been a whole lot of work done to identify a vision, and the vision was to develop a basin that provides a secure supply of good quality water for all domestic, industrial, and environmental users that maximise benefits to states. It's a fairly aspirational, high-level vision. Underneath that, they had 4 goals, which tried to turn that into more practical wording. And for example, one of the goals, I won't go through all of them, but one of them was that water users, including the environment, have clear, transparent, and effective entitlements to water. You can see how that's something you could pick up and actually put action to.
Thanks, Simon.
Pass to Dave.
And I guess just echoing, one of the key things about the BasinGuide is that it's meant to be adaptive. There are these 7 stages, but you could start anywhere in this adaptive cyclical process, and you always start where you are. You never start with a blank page in a fresh green field. You start with where you are. In Australia, we started with the different state entitlement and legal frameworks, and that's a reality, and we have to work from that basis. So that's one of the key lessons, really, from Australia's experience, and one of the key pieces of guidance in how to apply BasinGuide is to think about the context of where you're starting. And that leads very well into stage 2, but as you'll see in our diagram, it's deliberately the central space in the circle. It's central to every single other stage of the basin planning process, and that is engagement, meaningful and inclusive engagement with all stakeholders and with the community. Who needs to be involved? That might mean different things in different basins and at different scales. So there's the broader community as a whole, with all the range of stakeholders in the community, urban and rural, First Nations and non-Indigenous. There's industry, there's agriculture, and all sorts of other interests. As Simon has mentioned, in an international basin, there are all of the different sovereign states, sovereign nation states. In Australia, we have our sovereign subnational states who have legitimate interests in the process of river basin planning. But that engagement needs to be central to every single stage. It's important at the beginning to start with mapping out the different stakeholder groups, developing a stakeholder engagement plan, choosing the right stakeholder engagement method. Some of you will be familiar with the International Association of Public Participation spectrum of stakeholder participation. At the maximum end, you can have empowerment, where communities actually make the decisions. More usually, those decisions will be made by governments for a range of reasons, but still within that frame, you can have collaboration and involvement, or for some rapid processes or certain circumstances, it may be appropriate to have a more limited consultation process. It's important to draw on the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and all sorts of groups who may otherwise not get a full input to the engagement process, and to be conscious about how those groups are engaged. Groups such as Indigenous peoples, women, people with disabilities, minorities, and to make sure that that engagement process is equitable and there's a maximum opportunity for input and involvement in the process for all those groups. What sort of techniques can be used to ensure that all different groups and interests can be involved in the process, as well as actually drawing on all sorts of different knowledge bases, not just our standard Western approach of defaulting to technocratic types of information bases. It's important to share that information, have a transparency approach whilst engagement of all groups is important, there is absolutely a role for clear leadership and active leadership. Political leadership is important, a bipartisan approach if possible, and I think we have seen that hold together just in the Murray-Darling Basin context, where both the Coalition and Labor have been committed to the Basin Plan as a process, albeit there are different subtleties in their position. And continuing political support through, what is always a rocky road when you're negotiating between the different types of interests. And I guess, you could see that playing out in what Kim was talking about in the European situation as well. So part of that process of engagement is transparently identifying and assessing the values and objectives of all stakeholders and considering different forms of stakeholder governance, and again, the method of how you engage. Governance is an important step, and it links to that aspect of leadership. It links to the question of how decisions will be made on the basin and on the River Basin Plan. It is important to have enabling institutional arrangements, policy and legislation that can give authority to the process, that later on, when the Basin Plan is finalised, can allow it to be enforced and regulated. And there's a range, obviously, of methods you can use for regulation and compliance and enforcement. So it's not necessarily the big stick, although that also is likely to have a role. Creating that enabling environment does require these institutional and governance arrangements. Whilst community involvement is central, Without that regulatory framework, that legal framework, that enabling framework, there will be limitations to what a river basin plan can achieve. Another key stage is to undertake a situation assessment, assessing the current status and trends for surface and groundwater in the river basin. Basically, it's asking the question, where are we now? If things keep going with the current status and pressures and risks, where could we end up in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time? And whilst a huge element of that will be about empirical and scientific and technical information, it is important to build on community knowledge and common understanding of the basin. And identify issues of common concern amongst stakeholders and the community, which may help to focus what the River Basin Plan is about. This will also utilise water resources modelling, data, spatial data, and so forth. One important qualifier on this is that whilst it is important to have a good scan of the available information and to undertake modelling and so forth, it's also important not to let that be a blocker for progress on river basin planning. Again, you start where you are, you build information over time, get the cycle started, and if it's going to take 2 years to develop, comprehensive information, we'll have a first version of the process and let that 2 years of information inform the second version of the river basin plan. Planning, obviously, a central stage to river basin planning. But I guess, you will pick up on this subtlety that we've viewed actual planning as only one element of river basin planning as a whole. And there's a good reason for that. You need all those other elements to make the plan work. There's so many examples of both situation assessments, data gathering exercises, and plans that have basically sat on the shelf or formed doorstops and have not really made a material difference to the situation. And unfortunately, that's even more the case in developing countries. So very, very important that all components of the Basin Guide are seen as an integrated part of the strategy. But building a plan is obviously the core purpose for undertaking this. So what is building a plan about? We tried to distill this down, and whilst we're building on the river basin planning experience in the Murray-Darling Basin, we tried to step back from all those Australian specifics about entitlement frameworks and the history of the River Murray and the particular, upstream, downstream, interstate, interjurisdictional issues in Australia, and also the whole federal-state dynamic in Australia. Trying to sort of build on those experiences, but step back and find a kind of a spot where we can learn from those experiences, but be neutral about the exact context in which they take place. And what we settled on is that really a plan is about considering strategies, considering options, and obviously the idea that strategies is sort of high level, and a little bit and more strategic and long term, and options are getting down to things, ideas about how you might deal with issues that are more specific and that involve taking certain actions. Once you've got those options defined, eventually it's going to come down to negotiating trade-offs. You almost certainly can't do something about an issue, a driver of poor water quality or a driver of over allocation and poor water sharing outcomes. You almost certainly can't do something about that where everyone's a winner. Almost certainly there will be winners and losers, but by negotiating trade-offs and identifying mitigation options, you can create a situation where you can move forward and you can change things and adjust to get a better outcome. And of course, that's exactly what we've been trying to do in the Murray-Darling Basin experience in Australia. So the key question for this stage is how do we plan and consider options and decide what the strategies are to move forward, to do something about the issues that we're facing. So we evaluate those options using information, data, modelling, all the sorts of stuff we were talking about in the situation assessment. You might also have decision support tools, which is effectively how we use our hydrological models in Australia. You might have local data or local knowledge. You will have traditional knowledge from First Nations and so on. And you need to look at how those options play out to negotiate those trade-offs. And critically, you do need to agree on how those who are negatively impacted will be supported. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to move it forward. So if there's over-extraction and extraction has to be reduced, then those who are extracting have a motivation for doing so. It's either survival or it's, economic motivation, profit motivation. And there needs to be some support for them to transition to deal with those motivations that are leading to that. If it's pollution, well, what's the motivation for pollution? How can you change that motivation? It's critically important to identify responsibilities for implementation and to integrate those selected strategies into a basin plan. And just emphasising that right-hand block there in this diagram, that community engagement is a critical part of all of this. I guess just briefly, this is an example of how in the guide we have tried to deal with the issue of water sharing, which of course has been central to the Australian experience, water sharing in the context of water scarcity. We've tried to deal with it in a way that is neutral to the legal, market and political context, the political economy context of each nation or each river basin. So for taking that experience from Australia in the water scarcity, water sharing context, we've said you first establish what the system needs are. What is the flow regime needed to sustain the river and to set a sustainable limit to extraction? And that may be sustaining the river for ecosystems, and it should be, but it may in certain contexts also be about critical human water needs. In a way that it is in the basin plan, of course, critical human water needs, but it didn't really factor in heavily except in extreme dry periods. Whereas in other river basin contexts, those will be critical to system needs. After you've established those system needs and a limit, a sustainable limit, there's a question of distributing extractive shares. What's the basis for allocating water assigned to extractive uses? And that needs to be defined, and there will be elements of sort of ethical principles in there about distributing those extractive shares, and there will be elements of using the market and economics to reach a distribution, and elements of policy about what society wants in terms of whether grazing should come first or rice production or other issues. And finally, there is the question of managing demand and supply. Once you've distributed those extractive shares, what are the exact tools that you'll use, the exact options to manage demand and supply? And so if you sort of interpret those high-level steps, coming back to our Australian and Murray-Darling Basin experience, I'm sure you can see there, in Australia, we use our legal and regulatory and entitlement framework and certain aspects of the water market to achieve those three outcomes. And in many other river basins, I'll just note that there'll be a range of other operational strategies, such as around drought or flood management planning, groundwater management, water quality, pollution control, but also navigation, for example, which is critically important in many big river basins internationally. I'm going to be quite brief on the last two stages, as obviously we're running against the clock here. Implementation is critical, and I guess that's something that I would, and many others from the Australian water planning and river basin planning experience would emphasise. It is important to have a good process to engage and make the plan, but it's also critically important to follow through on implementation, because there are so many plans where implementation has failed. We've seen that in Australia and we've seen that internationally. How will we make it happen? And so critical elements of that are the resourcing, the responsibilities, the accountabilities for plan implementation. Being clear on who will do what and when. And some of the experiences we've had both at the state and the basin level in Australia have really illustrated the importance of clarifying roles about whose responsibility, which agency, which jurisdiction, and by when. Now, I've got a point there around regulation, compliance and enforcement. And I guess anyone who's been slightly awake in the last 3 or 4 years in the Murray-Darling Basin is very familiar with how important regulation, compliance and enforcement is. And we've seen that play out in the media and at the highest levels and be re-emphasised by governments and industry, importantly, as well as advocates across the Murray-Darling Basin. But I'll also emphasise that there are several aspects to that. One is obviously the importance of the highest profile of that, which is, prosecutions and convictions and fines and so forth for people stealing water. But it's equally important to have a robust system of water metering, to have audits both on water licence holders, but also audits of implementation by the government agencies or the water corporations or whatever the particular governance framework is. So in New South Wales, for example, the audits of water sharing plans play a critical role in checking implementation. And also that bottom end of what we commonly call the compliance pyramid, education and support and encouragement is also critically important. And just emphasising the community's role in behavioural change, in effecting that change to achieve compliance and implementation, but also in tracking compliance and reporting concerns and allegations. Finally, in any cyclical process, there's a critical role, isn't there, for monitoring, evaluation, reporting, adaptive management and learning. And accountability and transparency and implementation is one important part of that, as I've said. Data sharing and information management arrangements and transparency on that are important. And so is planning to evaluate, learn, review and remake the River Basin Plan. So here we are in Australia in 2021, looking at the review of the River Basin Plan in 2026, and planning is starting now for the evaluation that MDBA will do with the states in 2025 and how that will inform the Basin Plan review in 2026. The states have their own cyclical processes and they're at various stages in various water sources. Important thing about any critical lesson is not to start at the end of the process, but to set that up at the beginning. And we had a unique opportunity to do that with the Basin Plan and the legislative requirements to have a monitoring and evaluation program. So they're the 7 key stages. As I mentioned, you can start at any stage. They're all important. Engagement needs to be central to all of them. We've recently, now we've completed BasinGuide for us and for Australian Water Partnership and for Australia. There's the question of how do we apply it? It's relevant at a range of scales. We need to consider the context in each basin or country or state. This question of identifying key areas of need. What are the entry points is not always the same. It's not a cookie cutter. Looking at the BasinGuide has stages, has guiding questions for each stage, key actions and outcomes for each stage. So it's the kind of thing, you see the whole, but you can also dip into different parts of it. And I guess the key message out of it is that Australia has a range of skills and capabilities to assist. We're going to go to a discussion, I guess, in a little remaining time, comparing the BasinGuide and the EU water framework. But I just wanted to finish by thanking AWP for the opportunity to co-author this guide. Thanks to our co-authors, including those not here today, Tony Webber from Alluvium, David Harris, and Melita Grant from UTS. Thanking our reviewers, including Basin States, MDBA, and Phil Duncan in particular, Chair of the Basin Community Committee, and a Gomeroi man from Gomeroi country in northwest New South Wales, and thanking River Basin Management Society for the opportunity for this presentation. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, David and Simon. There's a couple of questions sitting in the chat that I'll get to. Just give me 2 seconds. Jasmine asked, yes, community engagement is crucial, but how do you deal with community conflict, stakeholder conflict? Both here in Australia and elsewhere, it is very connected to privilege and power.
Absolutely, and we could spend days or a whole PhD exploring that one, I guess. But what I will say is that I think privilege and power is obviously a broader issue beyond us as water managers, but what we can do to deal with the fact that those dynamics exist, that there are marginalised parts of the community and there are privileged and powerful parts, is to have transparency, to have approaches to stakeholder engagement that enable as many groups as possible to participate. I guess it's part of it's a continual adaptive process. It's never perfect, but we can, by using those techniques like more collaborative techniques, help to ensure that that all groups get to have a say. And I guess, look, it is never perfect, and we always move from where we are, but there are a range of initiatives going on at the moment. For example, to bring, I think my computers, if you want to switch on yours. Oh, can you still hear me?
We've still got you, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Good. My screen's gone blank, so I'm not sure what's going on.
But look,
there are a range of initiatives going on, I was saying,
to improve the extent to which First Nations values, but also critically their rights in the water management space are considered. And I guess that work's underway. Yeah, it might have happened earlier, but it is happening.
And maybe to move a bit away from the Australian example. So, I mean, Dave's talking about the need to both engage community early, and that was obviously a problem in Australia, and both in identifying the issue and objectives and vision, but then also in the decision-making process and making sure people feel or are clear how much agency they do have in the process, and then B, that they have that agency, whatever that's agreed. So sort of the decision-making process inclusion. But a pretty key thing as well in terms of ongoing potential conflict is what Dave was talking about is having a clear mechanism to offset or minimise the negative impacts, whether it be on communities or individuals or
You've gone silent, Simon. Simon, you've gone silent. You might have to unmute yourself.
Simon, can you hear us? We lost you for a bit there.
Yeah, sorry. Yep. Are you there, Simon? We're getting serious echo.
Is that better now?
That is, yep.
Okay. Did you hear any of that, or?
You cut out maybe 30 seconds ago.
Okay. Well, I think just to emphasise the final point I was trying to make then was around there's engagement in the process, both identifying issues and the planning process, but then there's moving forward. There needs to be a very clear mechanism or set of mechanisms to offset those that might be losing out because of the basin plan. Otherwise, yes, there will be continuing conflicts.
All right, thank you for that. There's another comment here that says there's no jurisdiction over irrigation infrastructure groups, IIOs. Murrumbidgee Irrigation's an example, and there's no jurisdiction at all over their internal dealings. Do you know about that that instance, or?
I can't claim to know a lot about that. I guess there are two things that come to mind. One is that there is state legislation, and so in New South Wales, there's state legislation that governs those corporations, well, all the irrigation corporations and irrigation trusts. You know, you've named a big one there, but there are many, many tiny ones as well. And the second thing is that there would be the broader corporate governance regulatory framework as well. Certainly, I'm aware it's an area that's in much discussion. I think it was something that came up a lot in the Murray-Darling Basin Water Markets Review by ACCC. But yeah, I think it's probably another separate discussion. But clearly, many of the principles that we've talked about would apply, except on a different scale.
All right, thanks, David. And maybe just to try and bring Kim into the conversation, maybe if you could have a think about the three of you, how, well, one, your BasinGuide could be looked at from a European perspective and incorporated in some of their framework, and Kim, potentially how the framework could be used internally within Australia as well, as examples for the best practice, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think David or Simon had a slide that had the two sort of processes side by side. I don't know if either of you could share that slide, because I mean, we were surprised, well, I was at least, when we got together to have a quick chat in advance of this discussion, how similar in process and steps they were. Obviously, David and Simon have gone through in a lot more detail than I did the Water Framework Directive process, and I think, yeah, there it is. I mean, there's a very similar, I think, process in terms of both the one that these guys have put together and the one that's been implemented in the EU. I think, you know, what I'm reflecting on as we speak is how, you know, across the EU there's so much cultural difference between member states, but this process has been implemented, you know, it's flexible enough to have been implemented in each context, not without challenges, and quite some large ones. As if you've been reading the chat, you know, Michelle's been talking about it bringing down a government in Ireland, so it's not been without consequence. But you know, obviously very different cultural context across the EU, and it managed to be implemented broadly, and it has been improving. And I think I'm probably more struck by the parallels than I am the strong differences in this process. I think they're really similar. David or Simon, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess I'd probably look at the question slightly differently, and look at about the learnings from both, and the learnings kind of captured in these two different processes here, and how they could be used in other countries to help guide a process that might be happening. So when, as part of the process that led to development of BasinGuide, it was originally a project, again, funded by the Australian Water Partnership through DFAT. And the intent there was, we went in and we had discussion that it was working on the Krishna Basin as a guide to then help the Ministry of Water there develop a process around how to go around basin planning. And Dave presented the diagram and the process at a workshop, And in the same panel session was a person from the EU that was essentially doing the same process at a state scale and looking at the Tapi River Basin. And they presented their very similar framework. And yeah, it was sort of, as Kim mentioned, it was quite a shock at the time just how similar they are. And I think in a lot of ways, the actual detail of the framework doesn't matter too much. There's some logical sense to it. It's about a tool to go and have discussions with countries to help them understand where they sit in the process and where the next steps might be and where they might be able to focus on to help progress their own basin planning process. And I think both these tools or frameworks are very useful to provide that content for those discussions. Anything to that there?
No, not really. I think as Simon's saying, that there's this core cyclical process, and we looked at other literature, and generally they had a similar sort of diagram. I think the key thing, for example, about the European framework diagram, but there are others we saw that were specific to particular contexts, is that they are specific to those contexts, whereas what we've tried to do is come back and be neutral about whether it's water sharing or water quality or navigation or all sorts of other issues that might arise in river basin management, that you could use the same process no matter what the context. And also, we definitely wanted to be neutral to the particular, what gets called the political economy. In other words, whether it's a federation or a centralized state or, a democracy or not, and all those sorts of things. Now, obviously, the engagement aspect will need to engage with the nature of the political system in each country. But feedback we got from people who'd worked in countries that aren't, on the face of it, democracies, is that there are generally frameworks within which they achieve engagement and consultation on issues. And I don't know if you want to talk about Vietnam or Cambodia or those sorts of frameworks. But anyway, there were frameworks for engagement. So you could still have this kind of process. Yeah. So it's a critical thing about having the cycle and critically making sure that implementation is an acknowledged part of the cycle. That's a real hobby horse of mine, because I've just seen so many plans made and things just don't progress, including in Australia. So it is absolutely critical. That's part of it, as well as the MER. But making sure that each of those parts is acknowledged.
Just to pick up quickly on your engagement example and highlighting Vietnam. So I think the lesson there is that it's about the outcome we're looking for. The actual process or steps that might happen might depend on the country that you're in. So Vietnam, obviously a Communist Party state, but actually their level of connection to communities is quite good, because right down to the commune level, which is sort of a city block, there's government representatives sitting in that city block that can then know what's going on. So actually their ability to engage with individuals in the community is quite good. So not necessarily the process we would go through here, where we would hold meetings, etc., but the outcome is still very similar.
Thanks, guys. All good points, and that engagement kind of comment leads us to a question from Michelle, who asks, how do we go through these processes to ensure that there is engagement with traditional owners and they're included in water planning and management decisions? And how do we incorporate traditional ecological knowledge in our management options?
I'd love to have Phil here actually to talk to that, who's the chair of the Basin Community Committee and also works for Alluvium as well. But I guess what I can say from my little experience in the basin and in New South Wales, is that the key first is to listen, is to engage and to listen, and not to go in with assumptions about what the issues are. The second thing, and this is an Australian context, but I'm sure it has parallels internationally, is that it's important to identify who can speak for country. And that's I suppose, can be a complicated process to identify that, but it's important to trust and what's the word, enable Indigenous nations to determine that. And critically also, that you may have representative bodies, for example, across a state or across part of a basin or whatever, and they're important, but equally you need to engage with those who can speak for country. And the listening thing is critical, and appreciating that there is important, if you like, cultural science there, Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, but it may or may not be appropriate for all of that to be shared. So you have to find a way to have the conversation and understand what it means for the water management, while respecting that knowledge, that IP, and that culture.
All right, thanks, David. There aren't any more questions in the Q&A, so
maybe I could add a little bit onto the cultural one before you finish. Then I think you know, to recognise that there's other countries in the region that are probably doing it better than us, and where culture is a much bigger driver for how rivers are managed. You know, India's a good example where the Ganga River is considered the mother of the country. So there's huge spiritual and cultural significance placed on it. And in fact, WWF have been doing some work in India around environmental flows. But they've actually found that articulating it as cultural flows and talking about how it enables the different rites for different festivals that often occur on the river is actually a much more impactful way to then see some action on afterwards, whether it's presenting to communities or presenting to the governments themselves. So yeah, I just think it's interesting always to look at how other countries in the regions are approaching similar challenges.
Yeah, very good point. All right, unless you guys want to add anything extra, there's no more questions coming through, so sounds like you're off the hook for any more questions. So I might just wrap the questions up there, and just thank you both for presenting. Really interesting topics, both of them, and a really interesting kind of conversation, bringing both of them together there at the end. So yeah, greatly appreciate you coming along today. Just thought I'd quickly touch on a couple of upcoming events for the RBMS. Abstracts for the Australian Stream Management Conference are due in less than 2 weeks. It's held in Kingscliff, which is a beautiful part of the world, and should be a really interesting kind of online as well as in-person event. April, we've got a couple of seminars, both on urban water management, in-person seminars in Melbourne and Brisbane. May and June, there'll be a range of webinars and seminars coming up, and we've got our ongoing streaming podcast that's proving to be quite popular as well. You can access that on our website. And of course, in August, there's the Australian Stream Management Conference. So yeah, just that's probably a wrap up. Thanks to David, Simon and Kim for coming along, and thank you everyone for attending. Unless anybody has anything to add from the presenters, we might wrap it up.
Nothing from me. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Still there, Ben?
Yeah, I am. Just waiting for everyone to leave.
Perhaps they've left their computer on. Anyway, well done.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I was a bit disappointed by the numbers, but I know there are about